Picture this. It's a summer night in 1814, and the skies over Washington glow red, not with sunset, but with flames roaring from the White House itself. British troops have marched into the young republic's capital, torched the government buildings, and left the very heart of American power smoldering in ashes. The message was brutal and unmistakable. The rebellious child that ran away from the empire is now tasting the fire of its old master. This may have been the closest moment Britain ever came to turning back the clock of history. The opportunity sat right there on the table. A brand new America divided against itself, with a shaky economy and a government still trying to figure out what it even wanted to be. On one side stood the British Empire, the world's supreme naval power, ruling oceans so vast that people joked the sun never set on the Union Jack. And yet, instead of pressing forward to reclaim the prize, the British stopped. Why? That question has puzzled historians and armchair history buffs for generations. A superpower bold enough to seize islands in the far reaches of the Indian Ocean somehow couldn't be bothered to scoop back up an entire continent it once owned. They had the troops, they had the navy, they even had the moment, Washington in flames. So why walk away? The answer is tangled. It lies at the crossroads of politics, global ambition, and a certain overly confident naivety among Britain's elites. Many in London sincerely believed America wouldn't last, that this fragile little republic would collapse under its own chaos, and that the rebels would eventually crawl back to King George begging for order. It sounds absurd now, but at the time it reflected Britain's deep faith that monarchy was the natural way societies function. And so, while they were locked in a life-and-death struggle with Napoleon across the Channel, the British glanced westward and probably thought, better to keep Canada and still have time for afternoon tea than waste our strength swallowing back this unruly child. That single fork in the road sent history down the path we know today. America wasn't retaken. Instead, it grew into the global power that would later reshape the entire world. But to understand why Britain passed up such a rare chance, we need to roll back the layers. From America's early chaos, to London's misplaced confidence, to the brutal wars of Napoleonic Europe. So let's dig into this historical paradox. Why did the empire on which the sun never set let go of the one colony that might have defined the modern world? The answer reveals not just grand strategy, but also misplaced faith, costly mistakes, and a touch of irony that history loves to sprinkle onto empires a little too sure of themselves. After the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the United States was officially recognized. But in truth, it looked less like a nation and more like a fragile experiment that most people doubted could survive. The central government was nearly powerless. It couldn't collect taxes directly, couldn't pay off its war debts, and certainly couldn't maintain a standing army worth the name. Each state acted like a mini-country, guarding its own turf, often ignoring anything that came out of Congress. The population, barely 4 million. Compare that to Britain's 12 million plus an empire spanning the seas. To London, America looked like a speck of sand beside a mountain. Collapse seemed inevitable. As one British statesman quipped, "This Republican shack will blow away in the first strong wind." Internal rifts only made that prophecy seem certain. Political factions bickered non-stop. Those calling for a stronger central government were branded potential tyrants, while those fearing tyranny blocked every reform. Even the veterans who had fought for independence rose up in anger when left unpaid. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, 1786-1787. A farmers' uprising that rattled the young republic, seemed like the ultimate proof that America was doomed to self-destruct. But history has a wicked sense of humor. Out of crisis came reform. In 1787, the states were forced to gather and hammer out a new constitution, a framework strong enough to bind the nation together. In other words, that wobbly shack got reinforced with sturdier beams just in time. America after independence wasn't a polished empire. It was more like a clumsy teenager stumbling through growth spurts. But that awkwardness made it resilient. Not tall enough to topple, not rigid enough to snap, but stubborn enough to keep going. And that was what baffled London. This little republic, so divided, so broke, so shaky, refused to die. Instead, it survived its weakest years and began to gather strength, enough to become a thorn in Britain's side for decades to come. To many politicians in London at the end of the 18th century, America wasn't truly an independent nation. It was more like a rebellious teenager who stormed out of the house. The British elite were convinced that after a few years of chaotic freedom, Americans would grow tired, hungry, and eventually come back begging for the crown's embrace. That belief didn't appear out of thin air. It was rooted in Britain's own history. In the 1600s, they had tried a republic under Oliver Cromwell. Within a decade, the experiment collapsed into disorder, and the people practically begged the monarchy to return. From then on, many Britons assumed monarchy was the natural state of society. So to them, a fledgling republic across the Atlantic looked like Cromwell too. Zero, doomed to fail. Some members of Parliament even imagined a rather romantic scenario. Once America realized it lacked an aristocracy to lead it, the desperate colonists would ask Britain to ship over a spare prince, maybe set up a shiny new throne in Philadelphia or New York. The empire would stretch wider than ever, and all would be forgiven. But reality turned out very differently. Americans weren't waiting for a savior king. They were busy writing an entirely new system, one where power rested in a constitution and in the people's votes. For them, Britain's defeat in the Revolution wasn't a temporary accident, but the start of a new order. In hindsight, the British assumption was both comical and dangerous. They underestimated the power of an idea, the idea of liberty and self-government. While London waited for the naughty child to come home, that child was busy growing up, building institutions, and proving it could run its own house. Think of it this way. The British pictured America as the kid who storms out during a tantrum and comes knocking back a few days later when they are hungry. But America didn't return for dinner. It learned to cook its own meal and then opened an entire restaurant. And so, Britain's misplaced faith cost them dearly. By waiting for America to collapse, they missed the moment to strike. Instead of crumbling, the runaway child grew strong enough to fight back, and eventually became a rival that could no longer be dismissed. If there was a boogeyman haunting Europe in the late 18th century, it was revolutionary France, soon to be Napoleon Bonaparte. From the 1790s to 1815, Britain and France fought almost constantly, on land and at sea. For London, the real danger wasn't a shaky little republic across the Atlantic. It was the powerful neighbor across the Channel, who might one day march an army straight into England. Against that backdrop, America was little more than a side nuisance. Still, this side story sometimes caused real headaches. Short on sailors, the Royal Navy began stopping American ships and forcing sailors into British service. Americans called it impressment. To them, it felt like kidnapping. The outrage boiled until in 1812, the United States declared war on Britain. For Americans, the War of 1812 became the Second War of Independence. For Britain, it was more like an annoying migraine while they were locked in a death match with Napoleon. Yet battles flared across the Canadian border, the Atlantic coast, and even inside the United States. The climax came in the summer of 1814, when British troops marched into Washington and set fire to the White House and the Capitol. Surely, many in London thought, that's it, America is finished. It looked like the perfect chance. America was weak, its government in chaos, its capital in flames. An empire that had swallowed half of India and Africa could certainly carve out a piece of this upstart republic. But when the smoke cleared and the diplomats met in Ghent, something surprising happened. Britain didn't demand a single inch of American territory. Washington burned, but the borders stayed exactly the same. Why? Because Britain knew the real battle was still in Europe. Napoleon might return at any moment. Any land grab in America risked dragging the war on when Britain needed peace quickly to focus on redrawing Europe's map at the Congress of Vienna. So they took the pragmatic deal: restore the old lines, sign the treaty, and head back to handle France. And just like that, the chance to retake America slipped away. Britain had been like a gamer locked in a boss fight, dodging Napoleon's deadly blows, while a mosquito called America kept stinging its ankle. Instead of swatting the mosquito, they kept their eyes on the boss. Smart for the moment, but that mosquito would grow into something far bigger than anyone in London imagined. During the War of 1812, Britain never seriously aimed to reconquer the entire United States. Instead, London had its eyes on a smaller but strategic prize: Maine. The plan was to slice it away from the Union and turn it into a brand new colony called New Ireland, a handy buffer between Canada and those troublesome Americans. And truth be told, the plan came surprisingly close to reality. British forces occupied much of the region. Union Jacks waved over towns in the northeast, and New Ireland seemed almost within their grasp. It was the closest London ever came to actually cutting a piece out of the United States. But then came the twist. When diplomats sat down in Ghent, Belgium, in 1814, the British delegation didn't demand Maine. In fact, they didn't demand any American territory at all. The Treaty of Ghent ended the war by essentially pressing a giant reset button. Borders back to where they were, as if the whole messy fight had never happened. Why would Britain throw away such a golden opportunity? The answer lies in Europe. Napoleon had been defeated and shipped off to Elba, but no one trusted him to stay put. London knew the real showdown wasn't over. The Congress of Vienna was redrawing the map of Europe, and Britain needed every ounce of strength to lock in a post-Napoleonic order. Holding onto Maine would mean garrisons, endless costs, and constant local resistance. A headache Britain simply didn't need when the stakes in Europe were so much higher. In cold, strategic math, the gain in America was peanuts compared to the risk of another continental war. So Britain made the pragmatic choice: end the fight quickly and head back to the real game. Here lies one of history's ironies. In America, Britain held a small victory, but on the global chessboard, they chose to sacrifice that pawn to secure the king. From a strategist's view, it made sense, but it also meant forfeiting the last real chance to break the United States into smaller, weaker pieces. By the time Napoleon was finally out of the picture in 1815, America had survived its adolescence and was too strong to carve up. New Ireland became nothing more than a dusty footnote in British archives, a dream that never left the page. After 1815, the United States launched into a whole new trajectory. Its population exploded, fueled by waves of European immigration. In just a few decades, the numbers jumped from a few million to tens of millions. Industrialization raced ahead. Railroads stretched across the continent, factories hummed, cities sprawled. By the mid-century, America was no longer dismissed as a nation of farmers, but had muscled into the ranks of the world's industrial powers, standing shoulder to shoulder with Britain, France, and Germany. Meanwhile, Britain's priorities had shifted far from North America. India was the jewel in the crown, and London poured enormous resources into tightening its grip there. By the mid-19th century, Britain plunged into Africa too, carving up whole regions during the scramble for Africa. And in Central Asia, Britain played the so-called Great Game against Russia, an endless, nerve-wracking chess match fought in mountain passes and deserts, all to keep the Tsar's armies away from India. On this global board, America looked less like a target and more like a nuisance, certainly not worth the risk of war. The key reason was Canada. By then, Canada was Britain's most valuable foothold in the Americas, and if London ever picked a fight with Washington, Canada would be the first casualty. To the British, Protecting Canada mattered far more than trying to reign in an America that had already grown too big. So relations shifted. Instead of plotting reconquest, Britain leaned toward accommodation. Border disputes were solved with treaties, like the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 and the Oregon Treaty of 1846. From bitter rivals, the two countries learned, sometimes grudgingly, how to live side by side. By the late 19th century, as America flexed its muscles overseas, taking the Philippines, Cuba, Hawaii, the British no longer viewed them as runaway rebels needing discipline. Instead, they were recognized as a rising partner that had to be taken seriously. Historians call this the Great Rapprochement, the Great Reconciliation. It laid the groundwork for the Anglo-American partnership that would later shape the 20th century. In short, by the second half of the 19th century, Britain realized the dream of retaking America was not just unrealistic, it was laughable. Peace with a rising United States was cheaper, safer, and gave Britain the freedom to keep dominating the rest of the world. The sword was set aside, and in its place Britain raised a diplomatic cup of tea. History doesn't usually allow us to play with what-ifs, but let's bend the rules for a moment. Imagine it's 1814.
This cannot be happening.
Instead of resetting everything at Ghent, Britain decides to hold on to Maine, carving it into a shiny new colony called New Ireland. Suddenly, the US-Canada border isn't just a line on a map, it's a crack running through the continent. An America that had already lost territory in its teenage years might have entered the 19th century weaker, less confident, maybe even permanently scarred. Push the thought experiment further. Picture the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. What if Britain hadn't stayed neutral? What if the Royal Navy had backed the South, blockading the Union's ports, with foreign ships off its coasts? The North would have been under enormous pressure. Perhaps the United States never would have reunited, splintering into two nations, an industrial union in the North and an agricultural confederacy in the South. Tempting to imagine, isn't it? But meddling in America never came cheap. Holding Maine would have meant decades of garrisons, endless expenses, and local hostility. Intervening in the Civil War would have guaranteed one thing: American retaliation against Canada. And if Washington decided to march north, the map could easily have been wiped clean of Canada altogether. One small gain in America could have come at the cost of disaster up north, something London was never willing to gamble. And here's the biggest irony. If the US had been chopped up or kept in a permanent state of weakness, would the world ever have seen a superpower America? What would the 20th century have looked like without American troops in the world wars? Without the Marshall Plan, without a US-Soviet Cold War to shape the modern order? Europe might have remained locked under old empires, or the world we know today might look entirely different. Seen in this light, Britain's failure to reclaim America was both a short-term loss and an accidental gift to history. The United States was allowed to grow whole, unbroken, into the global giant we all recognize. So here's the question for you. If you were a British statesman in the 19th century, would you have risked everything? Maine, the South, even Canada itself, to try once more to tame that rebellious child? Or would you, like Britain did, sit back with your tea and let history chart the course that gave us the America we know today? Looking back over that turbulent century, the reasons Britain never reclaimed America become clear. First, they were simply too busy fighting the real giants of Europe, especially Napoleon. Second, the global chessboard, from India to Africa to Central Asia, mattered far more than a few more states in North America. And finally, the United States they dismissed as fragile and temporary proved stubbornly resilient, growing stronger by the day until no empire dared touch it. We could joke that Britain lost one very profitable colony but gained an endless variety of teas from India. A bittersweet trade, fitting for an empire known for both pragmatism and irony. But the story carries a larger lesson. In history, underestimating a young, untested rival can be the biggest mistake of all. The child you think will stumble may grow into the giant that changes the world. America is perhaps the clearest example. So what about you? If you were a British leader in 1815, watching the White House burn, would you have given the order to strike again? Would you have gambled it all to bring the runaway child back home? Or turned your back, sipped your tea, and let history take the path we live in today? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so we can keep exploring these strange paradoxes of history together. Because sometimes, the smallest what-ifs lead us to the biggest questions about the past and about ourselves.